The desert fox stood motionless on the ridge, binoculars pressed against his eyes, watching something that made his blood run cold. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the most feared German commander in North Africa, had just witnessed American soldiers do the impossible. 3 days ago, he had crushed these same troops at Kasserine Pass, sending them running in what should have been their complete destruction. His officers had laughed, calling the Americans soft, unprepared, cowardly. Rommel himself had written in his journal that the U.S. forces were not worth much. But now, February 25, 1943, everything had changed. Through the dust and smoke of the Tunisian desert, Rommel watched a small American unit hold a critical mountain pass against an entire German panzer division. They should have been broken. They should have fled. Instead, they were fighting like demons, refusing to yield a single inch of ground. The same soldiers who had scattered just 72 hours earlier were now standing firm against his most experienced troops. Herr Feldmarschall, his aide, whispered nervously, "They are not retreating. Why are they not retreating?" Rommel lowered his binoculars slowly, his weathered face unreadable. For the first time in his military career, he felt something unfamiliar creeping into his chest. Not fear, but recognition. He was watching an army transform before his eyes, and he suddenly understood that he had made a terrible miscalculation. The Americans weren't weak. They were learning. And they were learning fast. "Get me General Patton's file," Rommel said quietly, "and find out who is commanding that position." His aide hesitated. "Sir, we already defeated them at Kasserine. They are finished." Rommel turned to face him, his expression grave. "No, they are just beginning. And that terrifies me more than anything I have seen in this entire war." What happened in those 3 days between Rommel's greatest victory and his sudden fear? What did the Americans do that changed the mind of Germany's most brilliant military strategist? The answer lies in one of the most dramatic transformations in military history, a story of failure, redemption, and the birth of the fighting force that would help win World War II. But first, we need to go back to where it all began, to the disaster that nearly destroyed America's reputation in the war, to understand why Rommel's change of heart would shake the foundations of the entire German command. If you want to discover how a crushing defeat became the catalyst for one of history's greatest military comebacks, then hit that subscribe button right now, because this story will change everything you thought you knew about World War II. Drop a like if you're ready to witness how American soldiers went from retreat to respect in just 72 hours. And make sure to share this with anyone who loves untold stories of courage and transformation. Because what happened next would prove that sometimes the most dangerous enemy is not the one who never loses, but the one who learns from defeat. 6 months before Rommel stood on that ridge questioning everything he knew about American soldiers, a young lieutenant named Jack Morrison from Ohio sat in a troop transport ship heading toward North Africa. He was 23 years old, fresh out of officer training, and absolutely terrified, though he would never admit it to the men under his command. "Lieutenant, you think we'll see action right away?" Private Tommy Walsh asked, his Boston accent thick with nervous excitement. Tommy was 19, barely old enough to shave, and treated war like it was going to be some grand adventure. Jack looked at the kid and felt his stomach tighten. Maybe not. Just stay sharp and remember your training. But that was the problem. Their training had been rushed, incomplete. While British forces had been fighting Rommel for nearly 3 years, learning his tactics through blood and loss, the Americans were stepping into North Africa with textbook knowledge and almost no combat experience. They had equipment, numbers, and confidence, but they lacked the one thing that mattered most in war. They had never truly been tested. Operation Torch had landed American forces in North Africa in November 1942, and initially, things had gone well. They faced light Vichy French resistance and quickly secured Morocco and Algeria. Newspapers back home declared it a triumph. Jack's mother had sent him a clipping with the headline, "American Boys Show Hitler What We're Made Of." But those early victories were deceptive. They hadn't faced the real enemy yet. They hadn't faced Rommel. By February 1943, American forces were positioned in Tunisia, holding a thin defensive line through a series of mountain passes. The Kasserine Pass was one of the most critical positions, a gateway through the mountains that, if lost, could allow German forces to sweep behind Allied lines and cut them off completely. Major General Lloyd Fredendall commanded the American II Corps, and he had set up his headquarters 70 miles behind the front lines, dug into a canyon with engineers using valuable equipment to blast his command post deeper into rock. His soldiers joked nervously that he was more concerned with his own safety than theirs. Jack's unit was stationed at Kasserine alongside thousands of other American troops. They had armor, artillery, and air support, but something felt wrong. The defensive positions were scattered and poorly coordinated. Communication between units was chaotic. Officers seemed more interested in following strict procedures than adapting to the reality unfolding before them. "We're spread too thin," Jack told a sergeant, a grizzled veteran from the First World War named Frank Cooper. "If they hit us hard, we won't hold." Sergeant Cooper spat tobacco juice into the sand. "Then we better hope they don't hit us hard, sir." On February 14th, Valentine's Day, German forces began their assault. But these weren't just any German forces. These were Rommel's Afrika Korps, battle-hardened veterans who had been fighting in the desert for years. They knew every trick, every weakness, every way to exploit inexperience. The attack came with devastating speed and precision. German panzers rolled through American positions like a knife through butter. The coordination that American forces lacked, the Germans demonstrated with brutal efficiency. Within hours, entire American units were surrounded, confused, and desperately calling for orders that never came clearly or quickly enough. Jack watched in horror as the carefully planned defensive line collapsed around him. Tanks that should have been positioned to support each other were isolated and picked off one by one. Artillery fired, but often at empty ground because reconnaissance had failed to identify actual German positions. The radios crackled with panic and contradictory orders. Fall back to secondary positions. The order came through finally, but by then it was already too late for many units. Private Walsh grabbed Jack's arm, his eyes wide with terror. "Lieutenant, what do we do? Where do we go?" Jack looked around at the chaos, at the young men under his command looking to him for answers he didn't have, and felt the bitter taste of inadequacy. They had trained for war, but training and reality were completely different things. "We follow orders," Jack said, his voice steadier than he felt. "We regroup and we hold the next line." But even as he said it, he knew the truth that would haunt him for the rest of his life. They were losing and losing badly. The mighty American army, with all its equipment and confidence, was being torn apart by an enemy that understood war in ways they were only beginning to comprehend. As Jack led his men in retreat through the Kasserine Pass, explosions lighting up the night sky behind them and the screams of wounded soldiers echoing off the canyon walls, he made himself a promise. If he survived this, if he got another chance, he would never be unprepared again. He had no idea that Rommel was watching this retreat with satisfaction, writing in his journal about American weakness, already planning his next move. And he certainly didn't know that in just 3 days, everything would change in ways that would shock both armies and alter the course of the entire North African campaign. The worst was yet to come, but so was the transformation that would define American forces for the rest of the war. The retreat through Kasserine Pass was a nightmare that would be burned into Jack Morrison's memory forever. Abandoned equipment littered the road, American tanks sat smoking and destroyed, and everywhere he looked, soldiers were running, their faces masks of panic and exhaustion. "Keep moving. Stay together," Jack shouted at his men, but his voice was nearly drowned out by the sound of German artillery pounding the positions they had just abandoned. By February 20th, the situation had become catastrophic. Over 6,000 American soldiers were casualties, killed, wounded, or captured. Entire battalions had been shattered. Equipment worth millions of dollars lay abandoned across the desert. And worst of all, the American reputation, built up through months of propaganda and early easy victories, had been destroyed in less than a week. Rommel's forces had achieved exactly what he intended. He had punched through American lines, captured critical territory, and proven to both his own high command and the Allies that American troops were no match for experienced German forces. In his headquarters, Rommel studied maps and smiled with grim satisfaction. "The Americans are not soldiers," he told his officers. "They are shopkeepers in uniform. Give me another week, and we will push them into the sea." His confidence seemed entirely justified. Every tactical decision he had made had worked perfectly. The Americans had fought exactly as he predicted they would, with rigid adherence to doctrine, poor coordination, and a complete inability to adapt under pressure. In Rommel's experienced judgment, they were simply not ready for modern warfare. But something happened that Rommel didn't anticipate. Something that would change everything. Back at Allied headquarters, there was fury. General Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces, received the reports from Kasserine with barely controlled rage. This was supposed to be America's proving ground, the place where they showed the world they could fight Hitler's armies on equal terms. Instead, it had become an embarrassment that threatened the entire Allied strategy in North Africa. "Get me Patton," Eisenhower said coldly. "Get me Patton now." General George S. Patton Jr. arrived like a force of nature. He was already legendary, known for his aggressive tactics, his demanding standards, and his absolute refusal to accept defeat. When he took command of 2 Corps on March 6, he looked at the demoralized, scattered American forces and saw not weakness, but raw potential that had been poorly led. Jack Morrison would never forget the first time he saw Patton. The general stood in front of assembled officers, his polished helmet gleaming, ivory-handled revolvers on his hips, and spoke with an intensity that seemed to crackle in the air. "I hear that some of you are concerned," Patton said, his voice cutting through the silence. "I hear that some of you think we can't beat the Germans. Let me tell you something. We didn't lose at Kasserine because we're not good enough. We lost because we weren't properly trained, properly led, or properly prepared. That ends today." He paused, letting his words sink in. "From this moment forward, every single one of you will be a soldier in the finest army this world has ever seen. We will train harder, fight smarter, and show Rommel and every German commander that they made a fatal mistake at Kasserine. They didn't destroy us. They woke us up." The transformation began immediately, and it was brutal. Patton demanded discipline with fanatical intensity. Soldiers who had been allowed to dress casually were now required to wear full uniform, including ties and helmets, at all times. Anyone, regardless of rank, who violated regulations faced immediate punishment. Officers who failed to lead effectively were replaced without mercy. "You think this is harsh?" Patton asked when officers complained. "War is harsh. The Germans are harsh. You want to survive? You want to win. Then you will meet my standards or you will be removed." But Patton didn't just demand discipline. He completely overhauled how American forces operated. He brought in experienced British officers who had fought Rommel for years and made American commanders actually listen to their advice. He redesigned defensive positions based on hard-learned lessons from Kasserine. He drilled his troops relentlessly on coordination, communication, and rapid response to changing situations. Jack Morrison found himself training 18 hours a day. Radio communication drills, coordinated tank and infantry movements, rapid repositioning under simulated fire. Everything they should have known before Kasserine, they were learning now with desperate urgency. "Lieutenant Morrison," Sergeant Cooper said one night as they collapsed exhausted after another grueling day, "you think this will actually make a difference? Rommel beat us once. What makes Patton think we can beat him?" Jack thought about that question carefully. 3 weeks ago, he would have had doubts. But something had changed in him, in all of them. The shame of Kasserine had been replaced by something harder, more focused. "Because we're not the same army we were," Jack said finally. "We learned what defeat feels like. Now we're learning how to make sure it never happens again." What none of them knew was that Rommel was watching. His intelligence reports told him about Patton's arrival, about the changes in American positions and training. But Rommel dismissed it. Training takes months, years to be truly effective. He had weeks, maybe days before he would strike again. Whatever Patton was doing, it couldn't possibly matter that quickly. It was a miscalculation that would cost him dearly. Now, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below telling us where in the world you're watching this from. Are you in the States? Britain? Somewhere else entirely? Let us know, because this story connects us all across time and distance. And if you're finding this story as gripping as we do, Smash that like button and share it with friends who love real history and untold stories of transformation. Trust me, what comes next will blow your mind. Because in just a few days, Rommel would learn a lesson that would haunt him for the rest of his military career, and American soldiers would prove that they were far more dangerous as students of war than they ever were as beginners. March 17, 1943. The sun rose over the Tunisian desert, casting long shadows across the rocky terrain near a place called El Getter. Jack Morrison checked his watch for the third time in as many minutes. His hands were steady now, unlike 3 weeks ago. Everything felt different. His men were different. He was different. "Contact in 30 minutes, Sergeant Cooper said quietly, scanning the horizon with binoculars. "German reconnaissance spotted our positions yesterday. They'll come hard and fast, just like Kasserine." But this time Jack felt ready. Every man in his unit knew exactly what their role was. Communication lines had been tested and retested. Artillery positions were coordinated with infantry and armor in ways that had seemed impossibly complex just weeks ago. Patton's brutal training had transformed them from a collection of individual units into a unified fighting force. "Let them come," Jack said, and he meant it. Rommel had indeed planned another offensive. His strategy was simple and had worked perfectly at Kasserine. He would use his experienced panzer divisions to punch through American lines at El Getter, exploit the breakthrough, and roll up the flank of the entire Allied position in Tunisia. His intelligence told him the Americans had reorganized, but he remained confident. You cannot turn shopkeepers into warriors in 3 weeks. At 0600 hours, German artillery opened up with devastating force. Shells screamed overhead and exploded across American positions. It was the same terrifying sound that had broken American units at Kasserine, the sound that had sent men running in panic. But this time, the Americans held their positions. "Wait for it," Jack told his men as explosions rocked the ground around them. "Wait for the signal." Through the smoke and dust, German tanks appeared. The feared panzers that had dominated desert warfare, rolling forward with the confidence of units that had never lost to American forces. Behind them came German infantry, experienced soldiers who expected another easy victory. They were about to receive the shock of their military careers. American artillery, now properly coordinated and directed, opened fire with precision that stunned the German advance. Shells found their targets with accuracy that seemed impossible from troops who had been so disorganized weeks earlier. German tanks that expected scattered resistance instead ran into carefully prepared killing zones where every American gun had overlapping fields of fire. Now, the order came through Jack's radio, clear and precise. American tanks that had been hidden in prepared positions roared to life, hitting the German flanks exactly as planned. Infantry units moved with coordination, supporting each other, covering advances and retreats with practiced efficiency. Everything that had failed at Kasserine was now working exactly as it should. The German advance staggered, then stopped completely. In his command vehicle several miles back, Rommel received the reports with growing disbelief. His units were not breaking through. They were being held, pushed back, taking casualties against an enemy that should have been inferior. He grabbed his radio personally. "What is happening out there? Why are we not advancing?" The response crackled back, filled with confusion and concern. "Herr Feldmarschall, the Americans are fighting differently. They are coordinated. They are not breaking. They are not the same force we faced at Kasserine." Rommel felt a chill run down his spine. He had made a career out of reading his enemies, understanding their strengths and weaknesses, predicting their moves. But this was something he had not anticipated. An army could not transform this quickly. It was impossible. Except it was happening right in front of him. Jack Morrison moved through the battle with a clarity he had never experienced before. Every lesson from Kasserine, every brutal hour of Patton's training, was paying off. When German forces tried to flank his position, his unit responded immediately, shifting their defensive lines smoothly and maintaining their coordination. When enemy tanks attempted to break through, American artillery and anti-tank guns were ready, positioned exactly where they needed to be. Private Walsh, who had been terrified and lost at Kasserine, now operated his radio with calm efficiency, relaying information and coordinating with other units like a veteran. Sergeant Cooper directed fire with the precision of a surgeon. Every man knew his job and trusted that every other man knew theirs. The battle raged for hours, but the outcome was becoming clear. The German offensive was not just stalled, it was failing. For the first time in the North African campaign, American forces were not just holding against Rommel's troops, they were pushing them back. By mid-afternoon, Rommel made the decision that would have seemed impossible a month earlier. He ordered a withdrawal. His experienced Afrika Korps, the force that had dominated the desert for years, was retreating from American soldiers. As German forces pulled back, Jack stood among his men, watching them go. They were exhausted, covered in dust and sweat, but their eyes shone with something that had been missing at Kasserine. Pride. Confidence. The knowledge that they could stand against the best the enemy had and not just survive but win. "We did it," Private Walsh said, his voice filled with wonder. "We actually did it." Sergeant Cooper spat into the sand and allowed himself a rare smile. "Damn right we did." But the most significant moment was happening miles away, in Rommel's command vehicle. The field marshal sat in silence, staring at the maps in front of him, reassessing everything he thought he knew. He pulled out his journal, the same journal where 3 weeks ago he had written that Americans were not worth much, and began to write new words that would become historic. "The Americans have learned rapidly," he wrote, his handwriting precise despite the moving vehicle. "They are not the force we faced at Kasserine. They have adapted with a speed I did not think possible. Their coordination, their determination, their ability to learn from defeat and transform it into strength, this makes them far more dangerous than I calculated." He paused, considering his next words carefully. "I made a mistake," he continued. "I judged them on their inexperience and assumed that inexperience could not be overcome quickly. But I see now that an army that learns from its failures is more dangerous than one that has never failed at all. The Americans have shown me something that terrifies me more than their numbers or equipment. They have shown me that they refuse to accept defeat as final." Rommel looked up from his journal and stared out at the desert, his mind already racing through the implications. If the Americans could transform this dramatically in 3 weeks, what would they be capable of in 3 months? In a year? The Afrika Korps was experienced and professional, but they had reached their peak. The Americans were still ascending, still learning, still growing stronger with each engagement. For the first time in his career, Rommel felt something unfamiliar when thinking about his enemy. Not just respect, but genuine concern about the future of the war. Back at Allied headquarters, Eisenhower received the reports from El Getter with barely restrained satisfaction. Patton stood beside him, arms crossed, watching as staff officers marked the successful American positions on the map. "You did it," Eisenhower said quietly. "You turned them around." Patton shook his head slightly. "I didn't turn them around, sir. They did it themselves." Kasserine taught them the most important lesson any soldier can learn: how to lose, learn, and come back stronger. All I did was give them the tools and the discipline to use what they learned. The days following El Getter were unlike anything the American forces had experienced since arriving in North Africa. News of their victory spread rapidly through Allied ranks, and more importantly, through German intelligence. The army that had been humiliated at Kasserine Pass had not just recovered, they had evolved into something formidable. Jack Morrison sat cleaning his rifle in the evening light, surrounded by his squad. The mood was different now. There was laughter, genuine laughter, not the nervous kind that masked fear. These men had been tested twice, broken once, and had risen from that defeat to prove themselves. "Lieutenant, you think Rommel knows our names yet?" Private Walsh joked, his Boston accent carrying across the camp. "Maybe he's got our pictures up in his tent, marked, 'Dangerous Americans.'" The men chuckled, but Jack saw something deeper in their eyes. They understood what they had accomplished. At Kasserine, they had learned what modern warfare really meant. At El Getter, they had proven they could apply those lessons under fire. The transformation wasn't just tactical, it was psychological. "Rommel knows more than our names," Sergeant Cooper said, lighting a cigarette. "He knows we're not going away. That's what matters." What Cooper said was true. though he couldn't have known how deeply it affected German strategic thinking. In his headquarters, Rommel was engaged in heated discussions with his officers about the changing nature of the North African campaign. The easy victories were over. Every engagement with American forces now required careful planning and respect for an enemy that was learning with frightening speed. They coordinate their armor and infantry now, one of Rommel's panzer commanders reported. Their artillery is accurate. Their defensive positions are well designed. They respond to our movements quickly and effectively. Rommel listened with a grave expression. How long did it take us to develop these capabilities? He asked his officers. Years, Herr Feldmarschall. Years of training and combat experience. And the Americans developed them in weeks, Rommel said quietly. That is what we are facing. Not just an army with resources, but an army that learns faster than any force I have encountered. He stood and walked to the map on his wall, studying the positions of both forces. His finger traced the Allied lines, stronger now, more coherent. The Americans were no longer the weak point in the Allied formation. They were becoming its backbone. Send a message to Berlin, Rommel ordered. I want them to understand clearly. The American forces in North Africa are no longer the inexperienced troops we faced at Kasserine. They have become a serious threat. We can no longer plan operations assuming American weakness. This message, when it reached German high command, caused consternation. Rommel, the brilliant tactician who had dominated North Africa for years, was essentially warning that the tide was turning. Some dismissed it as pessimism from a general dealing with supply problems and overwhelming Allied resources. But others, the more perceptive strategists, understood what Rommel was really saying. The Americans had discovered something the Germans had taken for granted. They had discovered that failure, properly understood and applied, was the greatest teacher of all. Back in the American camp, Patton gathered his officers for a briefing. Jack had been promoted to captain after El Getter, recognition for his leadership and the performance of his unit. He sat among majors and colonels, still adjusting to his new rank, still processing how much had changed in such a short time. Gentlemen, Patton began, his voice carrying the authority that had reshaped the entire corps. El Getter was not the end of something. It was the beginning. Rommel now knows what we are capable of, but more importantly, you know what you are capable of. He paused, looking each officer in the eye. Kasserine Pass was the worst day in American military history in this war. But it was also the most valuable. We learned more in that defeat than we could have learned in a dozen victories. We learned our weaknesses, our gaps in training, our failures in leadership and coordination. And we fixed them. Patton slammed his fist on the table, making several officers jump. Now we take what we learned and we push forward. Rommel is skilled, experienced, and dangerous. But he is also fighting on borrowed time. His supplies are dwindling. His forces are stretched thin. And most importantly, he is now facing an American army that knows how to win because we first learned how to lose. The officers nodded, understanding. The shame of Kasserine had been transformed into the foundation of their success. Every tactical improvement, every refinement in coordination, every lesson in Patton's brutal training program had been purchased with the blood and humiliation of that first terrible defeat. Over the following weeks, American forces continued their advance across Tunisia. Each engagement showed the progression of their capabilities. They weren't just holding ground anymore, they were taking it. German forces that had expected another easy victory like Kasserine instead found themselves fighting desperate defensive actions against an enemy that seemed to improve with every battle. Jack led his company through engagement after engagement, each one reinforcing the lessons they had learned. When German forces tried the same flanking maneuvers that had worked at Kasserine, American units responded with practiced efficiency. When panzers attempted to break through, they met coordinated anti-tank defenses that had been carefully positioned and mutually supporting. Captain Morrison, one of his lieutenants, said after a particularly intense firefight, "The Germans are fighting differently too. They are more cautious now, more defensive." Jack nodded, understanding what his officer was observing. They're not afraid of us because of our numbers or equipment. They're afraid of us because they don't know how much better we'll be tomorrow than we are today. That uncertainty, that's what Rommel can't calculate or counter. It was true. Rommel's greatest strength had always been his ability to read his opponents, to predict their moves and exploit their weaknesses. But how do you predict an enemy that is constantly evolving? How do you exploit weaknesses that are being corrected in real time? By April 1943, the North African campaign was entering its final phase. Allied forces, with Americans now forming a crucial component, were closing in on Axis positions from multiple directions. The inevitable conclusion was becoming clear to everyone, including Rommel. In his final days in North Africa, before he was recalled to Europe, Rommel wrote extensively in his journal about the American transformation. These writings would later become some of the most studied documents by military historians, because they captured something profound about the nature of military effectiveness and national character. Now, here's something I want you to think about. Have you ever faced a situation where a failure taught you more than success ever could? Where defeat became the foundation for your greatest achievement? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, because this story isn't just about war, it's about the human capacity for growth and transformation. And if this story is resonating with you, hit that subscribe button and share this video with someone who needs to hear about turning failure into strength. You won't want to miss how this incredible transformation shapes the final chapter of the North African campaign. Because what Rommel wrote in those final journal entries would influence military thinking for generations and reveal a truth about American forces that would prove decisive not just in North Africa, but in every theater of World War II. May 7, 1943. Captain Jack Morrison stood on a hill overlooking the city of Tunis, watching as the last organized Axis resistance in North Africa collapsed. German and Italian forces were surrendering by the thousands, their equipment abandoned, their will to fight exhausted. The campaign that had begun with such humiliation at Kasserine Pass was ending in complete Allied victory. "Hard to believe, isn't it, sir?" Sergeant Cooper said, standing beside him. "5 months ago, we were running for our lives. Now look at us." Jack nodded slowly, thinking about the journey they had made. From the chaos and panic of February to this moment of triumph in May. It felt like a lifetime compressed into a few months, and in many ways it was. The army standing here today bore almost no resemblance to the one that had landed in North Africa the previous November. "We paid for this view," Jack said quietly. "Every man we lost at Kasserine, every lesson we learned the hard way, it all led here." The statistics told a remarkable story. Over 275,000 Axis soldiers surrendered in Tunisia, effectively ending German and Italian presence in North Africa. The Afrika Korps, which had seemed invincible under Rommel's command, had been systematically dismantled by Allied forces that now included a battle-hardened, highly effective American army. But the numbers didn't capture the real story. The real story was about transformation, about how an army learned to win by first learning how to lose properly. Rommel himself had been evacuated from North Africa in March, his health failing and his strategic position untenable. But before he left, he had made sure his superiors in Berlin understood what had happened. His reports were blunt and carried a warning that many in German high command were reluctant to hear. "The American soldier has proven to be highly adaptable and quick to learn," Rommel had written in his final official report from North Africa. Initial assessments of their combat effectiveness were dangerously incorrect. They possess material superiority, but more concerning is their ability to rapidly incorporate lessons from combat experience. Unlike forces that remain static in their tactical approach, the Americans improve with each engagement. He had paused in his writing, considering his next words carefully, knowing they would be read by Hitler himself. Most critically, the American army demonstrates a cultural characteristic that makes them particularly dangerous. They do not accept defeat as a permanent condition. Where other armies might be demoralized by initial failures, the Americans treat defeat as data to be analyzed and corrected. This mindset, combined with their industrial capacity and growing tactical proficiency, represents a threat that should not be underestimated in future campaigns. These words, coming from a general who had earned legendary status for his victories, carried enormous weight. German strategic planning for the defense of Europe had to account for the fact that American forces were not the weak link they had hoped for. They were becoming one of the strongest elements of the Allied war machine. Back in the United States, News of the North African victory was celebrated with parades and headlines. But in military circles, the more interesting discussion was about what had happened between Kasserine and Tunis. How had American forces transformed so dramatically? General Eisenhower, in his reports to Washington, was candid about both the failure and the recovery. Kasserine Pass was a necessary education, he wrote. Painful, costly, but ultimately invaluable. It stripped away our illusions about the nature of modern warfare and forced us to confront our deficiencies. The speed with which our forces corrected those deficiencies is a testament to American adaptability and determination. Patton, typically more blunt, put it differently when asked by a war correspondent about the transformation. We got our noses bloodied, and instead of crying about it, we learned to fight. Simple as that. Rommel made the mistake of thinking that beating us once meant he could beat us always. He didn't understand that Americans don't stay beaten. For Jack Morrison and the thousands of soldiers who had lived through both Kasserine and the subsequent victories, the transformation was personal. They had faced the worst thing a soldier can face, complete defeat and humiliation, and they had not let it define them. Instead, they had used it as fuel. You know what I think about sometimes? Private Walsh said one evening as they prepared to ship out for the invasion of Sicily, the next phase of the war. I think about those first days at Kasserine, when everything was falling apart and I was sure we were all going to die or get captured. We all think about it, Jack said. Yeah, but here's the thing, sir. I'm not ashamed of it anymore. I mean, we lost, we got beat badly. But we came back from it. How many armies in history can say they got destroyed and then came back stronger? That's something to be proud of, you know? Jack smiled. The kid was right. In military history, there were plenty of examples of great victories and crushing defeats, but there were far fewer examples of an army that had been genuinely beaten, learned from that beating, and transformed itself into a superior fighting force in a matter of weeks. The lessons from North Africa would shape American military doctrine for generations. The emphasis on adaptability, on learning from failure, on maintaining coordination under pressure, all of these became core principles that American forces carried into every subsequent campaign of World War II. When American troops landed at Normandy on D-Day, they landed as veterans, even those who hadn't personally fought in North Africa. The institutional knowledge, the tactical refinements, the understanding of how to coordinate complex operations, all of this had been purchased with blood in the Tunisian desert. German commanders who faced American forces in Italy, France, and eventually Germany itself, found themselves fighting an enemy that bore no resemblance to the force that had been routed at Kasserine Pass. They faced an army that was professional, adaptive, and utterly relentless in its application of lessons learned. Rommel himself, as he later commanded German forces defending France against the Allied invasion, faced American units again. His journals from this period show a continuing respect tinged with frustration. They have become everything I feared they would become, he wrote in June 1944, shortly after D-Day. An army that combines material superiority with tactical sophistication and an institutional culture that treats every setback as an opportunity to improve. For Jack Morrison, the war would continue for 2 more years. He would fight in Sicily, Italy, and eventually France. He would earn more promotions, more commendations, and more scars. But he would never forget the lessons of those terrible days in February 1943, when his world collapsed and he had to choose between accepting defeat or learning from it. Years later, after the war ended and he returned to Ohio, Jack would sometimes speak to students about his experiences. He never glorified war or made it sound like an adventure. But he always talked about Kasserine Pass, about failure and transformation, about the cost of learning and the value of perseverance. The greatest lesson I learned in the war, he would tell those students, wasn't how to win. It was how to lose, learn, and come back stronger. That lesson, more than any victory, defined who we became as soldiers and as a nation. The story of why Rommel changed his mind about American soldiers wasn't really about Rommel at all. It was about what happens when human beings refuse to let failure be the end of their story. It was about transformation, resilience, and the extraordinary capacity of people to grow under pressure. The full impact of what happened between Kasserine Pass and the fall of Tunis would not be understood until years after the war ended. Military historians would spend decades analyzing those crucial weeks in early 1943, trying to understand exactly how an army transformed itself so dramatically in such a short time. But for the men who lived through it, the answer was always simple. They had no choice. They could either learn or die. They could either adapt or accept defeat as permanent. And something in the American character, something forged in a nation built by people who had repeatedly overcome adversity, refused to accept permanent defeat. Rommel's journals, published after the war, became required reading at military academies around the world. His analysis of the American transformation was brutally honest and filled with the kind of professional respect that only comes from facing a worthy opponent. In one particularly revealing entry from March 1943, shortly after El Getter, Rommel had written something that captured the essence of what he had learned. "I have fought British forces for 3 years. They are professional, courageous, and steadfast. I have fought French forces and found them brave but sometimes poorly coordinated. But the Americans, they are something different entirely. The British fight with the professionalism of career soldiers. The Americans fight with the determination of people who believe they are supposed to win. When you beat the British, they regroup and hold. When you beat the Americans, they regroup, analyze what went wrong, fix it, and come back at you with new tactics. It is this quality, this refusal to accept the permanence of defeat, that makes them perhaps the most dangerous enemy I have faced. At Kasserine, I thought I had taken their measure. I thought I understood their limitations. But I failed to account for their greatest strength, their ability to learn from failure faster than any military force I have encountered. They do not simply repeat what worked before. They constantly evolve, constantly adapt, constantly improve. If I could choose my enemy, I would never choose an army that learns this quickly from its mistakes." These words, coming from one of the most respected military commanders of the war, represented a fundamental shift in how the world viewed American military capability. The United States had entered World War II with a tiny professional army and had to rapidly expand to face experienced, battle-hardened opponents. Many assumed this inexperience would be a permanent disadvantage. Kasserine Pass seemed to confirm those assumptions. But what happened next proved them catastrophically wrong. Captain Jack Morrison, now Major Morrison, stood in Germany in May 1945, watching as the war in Europe finally ended. He thought about the long journey from that terrible day at Kasserine Pass to this moment of final victory. How many battles had there been? How many friends had he lost? How many times had he used the lessons learned in those desperate weeks in Tunisia? "Sir, they're saying it's really over," Lieutenant Walsh said. Private no more, Tommy had grown into a confident officer, shaped by the same fires that had forged them all. "It's over," Jack confirmed, feeling the weight of those words. "We won." But even as he said it, Jack knew that winning was more complicated than simply defeating the enemy. They had won because they had learned how to win, and they had learned that lesson at Kasserine Pass in the most painful way possible. The American military that emerged from World War II was fundamentally different from the one that had entered it. The institutional culture had been permanently shaped by the lessons of North Africa. The emphasis on adaptability, on learning from mistakes, on rapid incorporation of battlefield lessons into doctrine and training, all of these became hallmarks of American military thinking. When military historians later analyzed American success in World War II, they often pointed to industrial capacity, technological innovation, and numerical superiority. All of these factors were important, but the most critical factor, the one that Rommel himself had identified, was the cultural capacity to learn from failure. Other armies could be trained. Other armies could be equipped. But creating an institutional culture that treats every defeat as a lesson and every lesson as an opportunity for improvement, that was something rare and precious. Years after the war, in 1963, Rommel's former chief of staff published a memoir that included extensive discussions of the North African campaign. In it, he described a conversation he had with Rommel in late March 1943, shortly before the field marshal left Africa. "I asked him if he thought we could still win in North Africa," the chief of staff wrote. "Rommel looked at me with tired eyes and said something I will never forget. He said, 'We can win battles, but we cannot win the campaign.' Because every battle we win teaches the Americans how to beat us the next time. And they learn faster than we can adapt. I asked him what he meant. He explained that the Afrika Korps had reached its peak of effectiveness. We were as good as we would ever be. But the Americans were still ascending. Every engagement made them better. Their Kasserine Pass defeat had taught them more than our victory had taught us. That was the fundamental imbalance that would decide the campaign. This understanding, this recognition that learning capacity was as important as fighting capacity, would influence military thinking for generations. The United States military would build entire institutions around the concept of learning from experience, creating systems to capture lessons from every engagement and rapidly disseminate them throughout the force. But it all traced back to those dark days at Kasserine Pass, when American soldiers learned that defeat was not the end of the story. It was just the beginning of a new chapter. Jack Morrison returned to Ohio after the war, married his sweetheart, and raised a family. He rarely talked about his experiences unless asked directly. But when he did speak about the war, he always came back to the same theme. Not the victories, not the glory, but the lesson of Kasserine. People want to hear about the wins, he told his grandson in 1968, as the young man prepared to leave for his own war in Vietnam. But I'm going to tell you about the loss. Because the loss taught me everything that mattered. He paused, looking at the young man with eyes that had seen things no one should have to see. At Kasserine we got destroyed, utterly beaten. And in that moment we had a choice. We could accept that defeat and let it define us, or we could learn from it and let it transform us. We chose transformation. And that choice, that decision to treat failure as education rather than definition, that's what won the war. Remember that whatever happens over there, it's not whether you fail. Everyone fails sometimes. It's what you do with that failure that determines who you become. Those words, passed down from a veteran of Kasserine Pass to a new generation, captured the essence of why Rommel changed his mind about American soldiers. He had expected them to break under pressure and stay broken. Instead, they broke, rebuilt themselves stronger, and came back with a vengeance. The transformation from Kasserine to Tunis took just 3 months, but its effects lasted decades. American military doctrine, shaped by those experiences, emphasized adaptability and learning in ways that influenced everything from training programs to institutional culture to technological development. And at the heart of it all was a simple truth that Rommel had discovered too late. An army that learns from defeat is more dangerous than one that has never been defeated. Because that army knows both how to lose and how to win, and that combination of knowledge creates warriors who cannot be permanently beaten. So if you've watched this entire journey from humiliation to triumph, from Kasserine Pass to the fall of Tunis, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button right now, because history is full of these incredible stories of transformation and resilience. Smash the like button if this story moved you or taught you something valuable. And please, share this video with anyone who needs to hear about turning defeat into victory, failure into growth, and humiliation into strength. Drop a comment telling us what you learned from this story. Have you faced your own Kasserine Pass? How did you transform failure into success? Your story matters, and this community wants to hear it. Because in the end, the story of why Rommel changed his mind about American soldiers is really the story of human potential. It's about what happens when people refuse to let failure define them. It's about the extraordinary capacity we all have to learn, grow, and become stronger through adversity. The American soldiers who fled Kasserine Pass in February 1943 were not weak or cowardly. They were inexperienced and poorly prepared. But they had something that proved more valuable than experience. They had the capacity and willingness to learn from their mistakes, no matter how painful those lessons were. And that made all the difference. Thank you for listening.